Hi. This past spring, I attended a panel presentation on writing personal essays about illness and healing. The panelists were all instructors in a graduate level program on narrative medicine, and so I hoped it would give me ideas on how to best respond to students and student work about trauma. In particular, I was thinking about an MFA student I'd mentored a few years before who was working her thesis up to a traumatic moment, but the moment she got to that place in her thesis, she froze and wasn't able to write around it for months. I was also more recently thinking about a couple of students who had chosen to write about suicide attempts, in one case an attempt made just 2 months before our class started, and whose essays were similarly stilted with large gaps. I recognize these students' behaviors as trauma responses, but I found myself at a loss on what to do in the classroom. How do I respond to an essay when I'm not sure the writer is capable emotionally or psychologically of filling in the holes that the essay reveals? How do I balance the needs of the essay with the needs of the student sitting in front of me, and is pushing them or even asking a question ever too much? It was with these questions in mind that I signed into the Zoom panel, and with these questions in mind that I balked when the faculty member of a prominent MFA program in narrative medicine began his talk by proudly describing a moment when he kicked a student out of his graduate level workshop because she was clearly there to write for art therapy rather than for art. As he stated, she wasn't going to be receptive to his or others' comments. She needed a therapist, not a writing instructor. I'm not here to judge that instructor's decision, but it made me realize how ill-prepared we are to guide students writing about trauma, even in programs devoted to writing about healing and grief, or, as in my case, in the creative nonfiction workshop, where students pretty routinely write about various traumas and challenges that they faced. With that in mind, I started to do my own research into trauma-informed pedagogy, and I'm going to offer you the highlights of that research here. So the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration says that individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. Often, individuals experiencing trauma feel powerless during the events and are left with lingering feelings of humiliation, guilt, shame, betrayal, or silencing. I like the following diagram, which is based on the work by David Siegel, a psychologist, which shows how a traumatic event or series of traumatic events can cause someone's nervous system to shift out of what he calls the normal window of tolerance into what is called either hyperarousal, where the individual experiences anxiety and panic, or hypoarousal, where they shut down and become depressed and might even dissociate. What's important to note here is that learning best happens in that regulated middle state, when individuals or students are instead pushed out of regulation due to traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress. They're not going to be able to learn as well. What's also important to note is that trauma exists in your classroom whether you realize it or not. Studies have shown that anywhere between 50% and 94% of college students have experienced at least one traumatic event. One study has shown that 9 to 12% of college freshmen actually meet the criteria for PTSD as a result of those experiences. In addition, a significant percentage of college students will experience trauma while enrolled at their university. 28% of women, 12.5% of men, and 38% of gender nonconforming students are sexually assaulted while on campus. These numbers will likely increase in the coming years as a result of climate change and increased natural disasters, and we've also all seen this in our classrooms over the past few years as a result of racial tensions, COVID, traumatic stress linked to COVID, or just stress in general. So it's something we all need to watch for. In the classroom itself, trauma and traumatic stress can manifest as intrusion, avoidance, anxiety, and changes in mood and cognition. And I've included some of the common symptoms in this chart below. So being triggered by class material, frequently sick, frequent absences or late work, lack of motivation, being easily startled, highly stressed, or really defensive or sensitive to feedback, and difficulty staying on task. All of these are classroom behaviors we sometimes write off, but can really be caused by trauma, not just, the student's personality. What's also really important to note is that the students most likely to drop out of a class or of college are those who have recently experienced a personal crisis or who have experienced adverse events in childhood. Writing is often inherently therapeutic. Many of us know this intuitively. Writing can help us process difficult events, reflect, and discover new things about ourselves. In the critically acclaimed collection Bad Feminist, Roxane Gay at one point even says that she wrote essays in part because writing was cheaper than therapy. In psychology, this phenomenon has been studied under the label expressive writing. In a series of experiments, psychologist James Pennebaker has shown how writing about deeply personal issues and transforming thoughts and feelings about those experiences into language correlates with improved physical health, and on this slide I've offered a lot of specific examples. The reasons, he said, is that writing serves as exposure therapy, helps build a narrative around the event that can offer meaning and understanding, and decreases stigma and silencing. Writing helps the individual to begin to speak more openly about the event, and that has often led participants to disclose verbally to others, thus repairing their social network. Pennebaker's data, which helped propel the expressive writing movement and composition theory in the 90s, has raised and continues to raise important questions about the role of the writing instructor and whether or not creative writing instructors are serving in the capacity of a therapist. The narrative medicine MFA instructor who I mentioned at the beginning would likely argue that we are not, that we can focus on art, not on therapy, as if the two are mutually exclusive. His comment echoes many others who, whether because they feel overwhelmed with student emotional needs or undertrained, point out that writing instructors are not trained clinicians and should not be pretending to be therapists and might do great harm if we do. That writing for art or publication is different from writing to express emotions, and that if students' purpose is to write for emotions, they're not going to be successful creative writing students. Others, however, have made more nuanced cases. In Writing Is and Therapy, Wendy Bishop recalls, when my current administrative office was turned over to me with its student journal suicide file and the outgoing director's list of hotlines and crisis support numbers, I felt then, as I feel today, that saying what we're not therapists, not counselors, not specialists in affect or dysfunction, is not helping us to understand and prepare to be what we are. In Potentially Perilous Pedagogies, Teaching Trauma is Not the Same as Trauma-Informed Teaching, Janice Corello and Lisa Butler discuss the risk of coercing students to write about trauma and leading them to experience re-traumatization. However, they also add that not engaging the topic of trauma in and out of the classroom carries the risk of perpetuating shame, secrecy, or stigma. Their conclusion: in addition to integrating information about and discussion of trauma where appropriate, educators should aim to reduce rather than increase the risk of re-traumatization and secondary traumatization for students exposed to the material. In other words, we need a trauma-informed pedagogy. A system is considered to be trauma-informed when it realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential paths for recovery, when it recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in our case, students, staff, and faculty, when it responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and when it resists re-traumatization. And when I say re-traumatization, I mean anything that's going to kick someone's nervous system up into hyperarousal, where they're feeling a lot of panic, or shut down into hypoarousal. To do so, they've recorded 6 key principles for a trauma-informed approach, and that includes safety, so making sure everyone involved feels physically and psychologically safe, trustworthy and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, so making sure there's a sharing of power and decision making, empowerment, voice, and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender issues. In other words, making sure we're aware of historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, and how that can affect the way people are experiencing the environments that they're situated in. So what I've done is gone through the research on trauma-informed pedagogy and creative writing and pulled out techniques we can utilize in the classroom to address all 6 of these principles. So for safety, it's important to make sure that in our classrooms, trauma isn't stigmatized, but that students also don't feel coerced or forced to write about trauma or write about the worst thing that has happened to them. It's also important that we as instructors avoid minimizing or dismissing student concerns so that we make sure that we don't ridicule students or that there aren't power plays in our classrooms, impatience or disappointment. Also, we really need to make sure that there are systems in place to avoid re-traumatization, both for instructors and students. And some ways we can do this is to emphasize self-care and model self-care in ourselves so that we don't experience compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma, to include content warnings if appropriate, and to make sure that students and we all as instructors know what to watch for when it comes to the physical signs of re-traumatization, and to have resources ready if needed. And then a quote I pulled out from Penny Russen's essay, Beyond Trigger Warnings. She says, "A safe place does not mean risk adverse, but rather a place where young people feel supported to take interpersonal and creative risks." And I think that's really important in what we're trying to achieve in our classes. For trustworthiness and transparency, the syllabus has clear, consistent, and equitable policies and expectations, and we do follow those in the actual class. And making sure that we're using activities early in the term to build trust with our students and trust amongst students. For peer support, making sure that we're facilitating a supportive classroom environment by giving students ample opportunities to get to know each other through small group work, partner work, etc. Making sure we're offering a supportive workshop environment and that our workshop protocols are supportive. And then modeling empathy ourselves so that students see how to respond to student work, especially peer work that might be vulnerable in nature. For collaboration and mutuality, making sure that when we're responding to student work that we ask questions rather than giving directive feedback, that we're listening actively, and that we're giving the student chances to set the agenda for the kind of feedback that they'd like. For empowerment, voice, and choice, making sure that students maintain agency over what they write and how much detail they provide in their essays, so that students don't feel pressured to push past their emotional limits for the sake of a grade or meeting professor expectations. Also, of course, making sure that students feel validated, especially when they share work that they feel vulnerable about, but making sure we're also not offering too many choices, which can be counterproductive and in fact be overwhelming for students. Then for historical, cultural, and gender issues, making sure that we as instructors are familiarizing ourselves with cultural, historical, gender, and racial issues and how they might appear in the classroom. Diversifying course readings and helping the class become comfortable discussing and responding to diverse readings. And then utilizing techniques that make classrooms safe for minority populations. And when I read Felicia Rose Chavez's The Anti-Racist Writing Workshop, I noticed how closely so many of the techniques she discusses mirror trauma-informed pedagogy, which absolutely makes sense, right? Because racial trauma is a trauma. I want to end with a few comments on healing. So Bruce Perry, who writes a lot about trauma and is a psychologist, has noticed that there are 4 pillars of traditional healing. First of all, connection with community, kin, and the natural world. Regulation through rhythm, song, and dance. Beliefs, stories, and values that bring meaning to trauma. And on occasion, hallucinogens, or in our contemporary society, pharmaceuticals. And what I notice is that creative writing classrooms already do a lot to help students connect with 2 of these pillars of healing. Students find meaning and purpose in their experiences through writing, and they also create a community with each other and with us in which they often feel seen and heard. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration has said that individual trauma always occurs in the context of community. Communities that provide a context of understanding and self-determination may facilitate the healing and recovery process for the individual. Alternatively, communities that avoid, overlook, or misunderstand the impact of trauma may be re-traumatizing and interfere with the healing process. As a creative writing instructor, I've seen again and again how powerful a writing community can be. We all have wounds, and it helps to tell our stories in our own voices and to hear people respond to that writing, to see people take us seriously as writers and as humans. In the classroom every semester, I have students who find a community that they don't have elsewhere, who come to new insights about themselves and feel that their stories, some of which they've held really close, are validated. That's a powerful experience for students, but also for us as instructors. It's true that we aren't therapists, and so there are boundaries and limits to what we can do, just as there are boundaries and limits to what therapists can do. However, it's important to recognize that students trust us with their stories, that they have in fact gifted their stories to us. And as writing instructors who have signed up for this work, it is our responsibility to make space for those stories and to train ourselves to approach both the writer and the student with care. Thank you.